Disclaimer: this video will have a section on Metaphor ReFantazio's story, and as such that section will contain story spoilers. I will mark it in the chapters and give you a warning so you can skip it. Additionally, the footage playing in the background may spoil things like party members, so if you want to go in completely blind, play it first. All the footage you'll be seeing is from a New Game Plus run. That's right, I played through this super long RPG twice to make this essay. You're welcome. Alright, I know we're all stressed. The 2024 American presidential election just concluded. At the time I'm writing these words, President-elect Trump just recently announced his pick for Attorney General. We're all a little freaked out. Well, half the country is anyway. So let's just take a moment to breathe and escape into a nice fantasy world where nothing relevant to this situation is happening. Oh no. Metaphor ReFantazio is a 2024 Japanese role-playing game created by Atlus's Studio Zero. Studio Zero was formed after Persona 5 director and producer Katsura Hashino left the team that developed the modern Persona games, along with 14 others, and formed a new group to work on non-Persona projects. It was released in celebration of Atlus's 35th anniversary and contains a hybrid of the gameplay of several of its main franchises. For example, the battle system serves as a combination of the press-turn system from Shin Megami Tensei and the Rose system of Etrian Odyssey. This is not to say that the game doesn't have any ideas of its own, but that it is somewhat of an homage to Atlus's previous successes. But the backbone of the game is Persona. Like the three modern Persona games, Metaphor has you on a calendar. Your time is precious. You get 2 time slots to do activities in, less if you're dungeon crawling, you have deadlines for the main dungeons, you have social links, you have social stats. Fun fact, I was going to call this video Metaphor ReFantazio is the best Persona game, before I chickened out at the last minute. This is something I do believe, and we'll get into it later, it'll be the thing we end on. But more broadly, I want to talk about what makes this game such a masterpiece of an RPG. A real tour de force, both in terms of game design and as a piece of art. Because this is my game of the year for 2024, and I need to talk about it with someone. And you're that someone. Lucky you. Persona games follow a very similar repeating formula. There's a prelude to a dungeon, then a dungeon unlocks. You are given a deadline to complete the dungeon, you complete the dungeon, you fight the boss, the dungeon ends, and then you have the rest of the time before the deadline to do whatever you want. Rinse and repeat. This is not a bad structure, but it is a bit repetitive, and I think Studio Zero realized that because Metaphor borrows that structure but improves upon it in one key way: variety. See, the first major dungeon, Regolith Grand Cathedral, operates about as you'd expect, following the Persona formula, but then in the second chapter of the game you travel to the castle town of Martyra on the tail of a bounty, and that leads you to the giant sandworm's nest. So you travel there and there's 2 mini dungeons to go through. And then when you secure your bounty, you travel back to Martyra, except it turns out that was all prelude, and you've just unlocked the real dungeon. And it continues from there. The third main dungeon? It's based around stealth and puzzle box boss fights, and you can't complete it fully until the day of the deadline. The fourth? A maze full of riddles. The fifth? You have only 1 day to complete it. And so the formula doesn't feel as stale because the game keeps throwing these curveballs at you. Also, can we just talk about how quickly they get you into gameplay here? It's like they intentionally get you running around and fighting things as quickly as they can in the prologue, so even though in my first playthrough it took me about 5 hours to get to the actual start of the game, I didn't feel like it was a slow 5 hours. This is a far cry from Persona 5 or, God forbid, Persona 4. Another lesson learned. Another way the game keeps itself feeling fresh is through travel. After the first dungeon, your party acquires a gauntlet runner, a mighty walking vehicle which can transport them throughout the country. Each new main dungeon takes place in a new city, in a new region of the map. Whereas in Persona you're traveling the same streets every day, in Metaphor you're visiting new locations all the time. And this extends into the dungeons too. Take Persona 5 for instance. In that game, every main dungeon had a unique look and feel, but your dungeon for grinding in between main dungeons, Mementos, was a randomly generated maze with basically no variety other than palette swaps. In Metaphor, every side dungeon is unique and handcrafted. And finally, the game even introduces variety into your party. In Persona, barring a mascot character, every member of the party is a teenager. And that works out fine for Persona. It would be weird to randomly have an adult in the party when everyone else is in high school. But in Metaphor, your party consists of a variety of characters with a variety of ages, tribes, and backstories. In fact, that variety is the point of the party. The fact that it is made up of many of the world's tribes becomes a major point in the story. It plays into grander themes of collective strength and strength in diversity, which we'll touch on more later. So in these ways, Metaphor takes from Persona but also learns from it, and improves upon it, by breaking from some of the series' conventions. And it's only able to do that because it has that freedom as a new IP. It's set free from the conventions that bind Persona. Another way it improves upon what came before it is in field combat. In Persona games, you can strike an enemy in the field to initiate battle. This allows you to go first. 5 throws some stealth mechanics into the mix, but that's about it. In Metaphor, this has been expanded upon greatly. You can still strike enemies in the field, but this has been turned into an actual combat system. You can lock onto enemies and zip straight to them. Hitting an enemy decreases their break gauge, and when their gauge hits 0, they will be stunned. Initiating battle now will begin not only with you going first, but also with the enemy taking damage and being afflicted with the stun status effect, which forces them to skip one of their turns. Additionally, if an enemy is a lower level than your entire party, they will be marked with a blue aura, and you can kill them on the field without entering a squad battle, which makes dealing with low-level enemies a breeze. It's been 30 years since Earthbound came out, people. Every RPG should have this. Persona 5 had something kinda like this locked behind Ryuji's social link, but it was only a random chance, and if it happened you didn't get any of the experience, so it was pretty worthless. But on top of all that, you also have a dodge button, so you can actually properly avoid enemy attacks. If an enemy hits you first, they still go into battle with the advantage, so it's in your best interest to do this. And attacks are telegraphed by the enemy flashing, so you can avoid them, although it does feel like you can't cancel an attack into a dodge, so it is a little clunky sometimes. And on top of all that, every archetype you can equip, more on that later, comes with its own weapon type, and each weapon type works differently in field combat. The mage's staffs lock you in place but emit a huge AoE burst. The faker's knives can do small AoE attacks at a distance. The warrior's greatswords are slow but do large sweeps. The gunner's crossbows can shoot in a straight line. Each one has advantages and disadvantages, and they're all fun to play with. And certain archetypes even have skills which affect field combat. The knight, for instance, gives a chance to counter enemy attacks on the field, whereas the faker gives you a chance to auto-dodge. And so where in Persona field combat just feels like a tiny addition to battles, in Metaphor it's a whole system. It's just so cool they were able to elevate the original mechanic like this. And speaking of mechanics, let's talk about archetypes. This is one area where there's kind of a trade-off compared to Persona. In Persona, the protagonist can hold several personas at once and switch between them at will. In Persona 5, there were 232 personas available to the player. However, only the protagonist could do this. Every other party member was locked to their starting persona. In Metaphor, instead of personas, there are archetypes. There are only 46 archetypes in total, comprising 14 lineages plus one extra secret one, and you can only channel one at a time. They cannot be switched out mid-combat. However, any party member can study any archetype once it's unlocked, and archetypes can inherit a certain number of skills from any other archetype that character has studied, which allows for a considerable amount of party customization. It's sort of similar to the job system in Final Fantasy Tactics, as I understand it, though I haven't actually played Tactics, so if I'm off base on that, feel free to leave a comment. So whereas in Persona the protagonist has many options, but the rest of the party doesn't, in Metaphor everyone has the same number of options, but there's less options overall. But also those options are more specialized and fulfill specific roles. The Faker does debuffs, the Commander buffs the party, the Seeker is an all-rounder, the Mage hits elemental weaknesses, etc. And again, archetypes can inherit skills from other archetypes you've learned, so you can shore up existing weaknesses or add additional utility to the archetypes you want to use by leveling up other ones. And the big advantage of this is that because the only limit on customization is a currency called mag, and there are a lot of ways to get mag, it's very easy to tailor your party to face any obstacle. In fact, party specialization seems to be the intent of the designers. You can buy information about most dungeons and bosses in the game ahead of facing them, so you'll have some idea of what you'll be dealing with, and you might as well adjust your party to counter that. Some enemies will get stronger if you have certain archetypes in your party, too, so you'll need to work around that sometimes. There's even an entire major dungeon where tailoring your party composition to counter mini-boss gimmicks is practically required. The game wants you to play with these mechanics. I'm not sure which system I personally prefer between Metaphor and Persona, but I do like the way archetypes tie into the follower system, so let's talk about that next. Followers are your social links, your confidants in Persona 5 terms. There are 14 followers in the game. Where in Persona each social link ties into the Arcana, in Metaphor each follower corresponds to an archetype lineage. Leveling up a follower's social link will grant you new bonuses and stronger archetypes in their lineage. For example, beginning Maria's social link grants you the healer archetype. Leveling it up further will eventually grant you the cleric, and finally the sovereign. This is a more direct reward than in Persona, where leveling up social links only grants you bonus experience to new personas of that arcana. Leveling up follower ranks is also how you earn more slots for inherited skills on that lineage, as well as all kinds of other bonuses. Here's a very welcome change to social links though. In Persona, you level up your bond with someone slowly, through points primarily accrued through selecting choices that they will like on outings. Well, in Metaphor, the same thing applies, except instead of giving you points towards social links, good dialogue choices will give you bonus mag, the currency used to study archetypes. Instead, your social link with a follower will be increased in rank every time you choose to spend time with them. This makes it much easier to max everyone's social links in a normal playthrough without a guide, something that, I think, plagues the Persona games if you're looking to see as much as you can. Also, I couldn't really find a place to put this, but you know how Persona has social stats? Well, so does Metaphor, except Metaphor actually gives you a visual indication of how close you are to leveling one up. Crazy, right? How did it take this long for them to give us a meter for this? But Metaphor isn't just Persona. Let's talk about the battle system, which, in my opinion, is one of the best collections of ideas I've ever seen in a JRPG. The basis of the battle system is SMT's press turn system. Introduced in Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne, the press turn system is based on turn icons. You generally get one turn icon per character in your party. Icons are expended when you take an action. When your party's out of icons, control passes to the enemy party, who gets their own icons. Simple. Or not, because if you hit an enemy's weakness or score a critical hit, you only expend half a turn icon. And you can still take an action on half an icon, which means your party gets an extra action this turn. So if you have a party of 4 and you hit an enemy's weakness with every member, you actually get 8 actions. Each of your party members gets to act twice. This means that, like in Persona, if you go first to have good party composition, most normal battles will end on the first turn. But this also governs your opponents, and battles can easily spiral out of your control. Doubly so because if you miss an attack it consumes extra icons, and if your attack is repelled, that's your entire turn gone. I've seen a lot of differing opinions on which is better between Persona and SMT's battle systems over the years, and in the past I've always preferred Persona's. There's a snappiness to Persona's all-out attacks that I enjoy. But now, after spending a lot more time with the press turn system, I think I'm starting to be swayed over to its side. It's just so technical. Persona's system is kind of a turn your brain off kind of affair most of the time, despite being incredibly flashy and satisfying. Press turn makes you think. The game also carries over combo skills, now called synthesis, from Digital Devil Saga, strong skills which require combinations of party members that consume the turn icons of both of them, so your party composition also matters here. But it's not just SMT. Metaphor also includes a version of the Rose mechanic from Etrian Odyssey in the Persona Q games. Party members can either be put into the front or back row, and can change rows freely on their turn without consuming a turn icon. Characters in the front row will hit harder with physical attacks but will take more damage, whereas characters in the back row will have weaker physical attacks but will gain a buff to defense. Certain archetypes will do better in one row than the other. For example, the Gunner archetype has physical skills which can be used in the back row and don't take a penalty. On the other hand, archetypes like the Warrior, which only learn physical skills, are pretty much required to be in the front. But because you can change rows at will during battle, you can adjust your formations to match the challenge at hand. If you're taking a lot of damage, for example, you could sacrifice some attack power and move everyone to the back for a war of attrition. It's very flexible, and unlike in the Etrian Odyssey games, the enemy party only has a front row, so you don't have to worry about members of your party in the back row not being able to hit things. All of this combined with the archetype system and the field combat systems leads to an incredible battle system, one that I genuinely hope they bring forward to future games or even carry over aspects of to the next Persona or SMT. It's very engaging. I want more of it. As an example of how all this comes together, I was severely underleveled going into the final boss due to a lapse in judgment earlier in the game. Rather than grind, though, I decided to strategize. The trouble with the final boss, spoilers by the way, is that on his final turn icon he does an action which sets him up for a really big move on the next turn. The normal way to deal with this is to do enough damage to him after he sets up that it knocks him out of it. Unfortunately, on his next turn, even though he doesn't get to do the really big move, he still sets up at the end of his turn for his next really big move. So you're constantly stuck in his rhythm, dancing to his tune, and that doesn't leave you any room for things like healing or buffs, which is bad because his main modes of dealing damage are full party attacks. My counterplay to this was twofold. First, I put either the counter or magic counter skills from the Knight lineage on everyone in the party. These skills give a 15% chance of reflecting an attack, physical for counter, magic for magic counter, back at the caster. Additionally, I would have Hulkenberg in my starting lineup because her final archetype learns Omni Counter, a passive ability that grants a 30% chance to reflect any attack. This was in addition to her also having both of the other counter abilities. Secondly, I put skills for erecting physical or magic barriers on Juna. These let a party member repel an attack of the respective type that would have hit them. You may recall that earlier I mentioned that when an attack of yours is repelled, it removes all of your turn icons and your turn ends. This is also true of the enemy party, and in this case, the final boss. So what I would do is I would cast a barrier spell on my least bulky party member, then hope that on his turn the boss would either use a party-wide attack of that type, or that one of my counter abilities would go off. This would end his turn immediately, meaning he never got to act on his final turn icon, meaning he never got to set up at all. This strategy only got me far enough to learn that A, he had a second health bar, and B, that I couldn't get through the first health bar with enough MP left to finish the fight. And I did end up loading an old save, and then grinding up to the level cap just to humiliate him. But I think this adequately describes how the technicalities of the battle system combine with the flexibility and extensiveness of the party customization options to create something that is simply better than the sum of its own, already fantastic parts. One more clever bit of mechanical design before we move on. If you have maxed out an archetype's level, they go up to 20, that archetype becomes mastered. A mastered archetype will continue to accrue experience. For every 1000 experience it gains, you will earn an item called a Hero's Leaf of Light, which can be used to grant 1000 experience to any archetype on any character. Additionally, party members who are not currently in the active party will still gain experience, including archetype experience, after a battle, albeit at a lower rate. However, one of the bonuses you can get through every party member's social link allows them to gain more experience in reserve, eventually maxing out at the normal rate as if they had taken part in a battle. By the time you start getting new party members, if you haven't been mismanaging your time horribly, some or all of your old party members will probably have mastered their archetypes and be earning decent XP in reserve. This means that you can bench them for the new character, and in the meantime they'll still be accruing their own levels and generating Leaves of Light to feed to the new characters to level up their archetypes faster, which allows you to basically snowball your way to having a decently strong party for the entire game and feel clever about it because you made good decisions. And if you ever need to grind one archetype up, you can just switch every other character to an archetype they've mastered and have them generate experience items for you. By the end of the game you'll be swimming in the things, and you'll want them because you actually get nice bonuses for filling out your archetype trees. Alright, I'll stop gushing about Metaphor's good design. Let's talk about something else. Warning, this is where the story spoilers start. Skip to chapter 4 if you care. I don't want to go through the entire story because, well, you should experience it yourself. Similarly, I'm not going to be one of those YouTubers who does those story explained videos. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a summary of the premise, then I'm going to give you just a slice of what I think is some of the game's best writing, and finally we'll discuss the game's major themes. Sound good? Okay. The premise of the game is thus. The kingdom of Uchronia has devolved into misery and stagnation. The Sanctus Church has wormed its way into all facets of the government, and tribal status and economic prejudice runs rampant through society. Monstrous beasts called humans are destroying villages on the borders, and to top it all off, the king of this land has just been murdered by a young upstart count, Luis Guillaber. 12 years before the start of the game, the king's son, the prince, was put under a deadly curse by an assailant who has also been identified as Luis. He lies now in a magic-induced slumber in the ancient Elden Sanctum, his survival only known by a select few. You and your fairy companion Gallica are two of those few. Your mission is to travel to the royal capital and, along with your allies, assassinate Luis before you can make a claim to the throne. Plans go awry, however, when the king's death sets off a royal magic that ensures that the next king will be the one with the most support among the citizenry. In other words, he or she will be a democratically elected leader. Now you must travel throughout Uchronia in your own bid for the throne, biding your time until you have the chance to end Luis and raise the prince to his rightful place as ruler. Crazy stuff, I know. Now let's talk about that story slice I mentioned. Martira. For context, at this point in the game your party has traveled to a small castle town called Martira on the tail of a bounty. They need a head for an event called the Exhibition of the Brave. It's part of the campaign to elect the next king. The man you're after is named Haisme, an ex-royal knight, who is accused of kidnapping Martira's children and selling them to parts unknown. The bounty is being funded by the Lady of Martira, Joanna, who is a prominent figure in the Sanctus Church, the state religion of the kingdom. After tracking Haisme to his camp in the nest of a giant sandworm, getting eaten by a human pretending to be a giant sandworm, and exiting through the gift shop of the human pretending to be a giant sandworm, the party confront Haisme. He's a Ujiv, small, bat-like people that tend to be relegated to the fringes of society. The party discover that Haisme has lost a child of his own, but they don't find any of the kidnapped children. Taking Haisme back with them, they return to Martira, only to learn that more kidnappings have taken place while Haisme was under guard. What's more, Haisme notices something strange moving about the town streets at night, and hears the sound of a child's cry in Krigante Castle. Investigating the area under the castle, the party makes a grim discovery. Wooden carts full of children being taken to feed a shadowy monster in the dungeons. They confront the man responsible, a member of the town's guard named Morris, and Haisme awakens to the thief, his archetype. The party chases Morris through the castle's dungeons, all the while narrowly avoiding the beast that stalks its waterways. Eventually they make it up into the castle proper, and then they discover this room. It's a child's nursery, but it's clearly for no normal child. The crib is enormous, everything is in tatters. A portrait of a pregnant Lady Joanna sits against a wall, the canvas shredded. They find a diary here, penned by a nanny. It tells the tale of Lady Joanna's child, born of an intertribal relationship, a half-breed. The father was driven out of the country, leaving only the son and the mother behind to deal with the prejudice of Joanna's noble family. The nanny, believing the boy's mixed heritage to be an ill omen, slew him in his crib before the birth could even be announced. The party presses onward, only to find the shadowy beast they'd been avoiding in the loving embrace of Joanna. She'd been feeding the town's children to it, believing it to be her own child in her grief. It eats Morris in front of you at her urging. Blood spatters across the carpet. The party is in disbelief. One of its earliest members, Stroll, asks Haisme if he condemns her, killing children and letting the blame fall on his name. And then Haisme says this.
For it. In truth, I know this woman's pain all too well. In the name of her child, she was willing to turn against the entire world. Behind her atrocities, I see the devotion of a bereaved parent. You found yourself unjustly in a terrible darkness, and I struggle to blame you. Burying your own child is unbearable. Grief and madness fill the gaps where love had been. but my eyes were opened. These people helped me see. The only way to beat the darkness is to confront it. Step by meager step. You must walk back to our reality. Look upon that, and see true that it is not the child you once loved.
He doesn't condemn her. He understands. He's lost a child too. He wants to bring her back from this madness. After the human is slain, he tells her his story, about how his own son was beaten bloody in a riot, how not a single person stopped to help him as he slowly bled to death. He was a Ujif, and to them that's all he was. By the time Haisme got there, it was far, far too late. So he ran from it, made a home in the nest of a great beast that could have killed him in an instant because death would have been a mercy. He was only freed from this pit of sadness when the party came along and he realized that this was not the life his son would have wanted him to live. He tells her this to force her to confront reality, the painful, unbearable reality of the death of her child, because it is only in facing the pain that we begin to live again. Joanna regains her senses. She offers to present her head at the exhibition in place of Haisme's, confess to her crimes in front of an audience of thousands. She is not absolved of her sins. This doesn't make up for what she's done. In fact, if you come back to Martira after her confession, there are even townsfolk who will talk about how none of this will bring back their children. But it's the only way she can atone in her own mind. She will do this of her own volition. As the scene ends, Joanna remarks that it is as if a fog has finally lifted from her. This is not a story that could have been told in a Persona game. It simply would not have fit. And yet, it is some of the strongest writing to possibly ever have come out of Atlas. The layers of emotion conveyed throughout this chapter are simply astonishing. A lesser game would have made Joanna a monster. A Persona game would not have had anyone in the cast who could have empathized with her. Only Metaphor could have pulled this off, through complex storytelling and rich character writing. Only through being freed of the conventions that bound its predecessors. Haisme's social link is entirely about him trying to find a place to lay his son's bones to rest, as well as overcoming stagnation in the village he abandoned. Joanna, meanwhile, is executed at the exhibition by the head of the church she herself served. She is not given a trial. The public will never understand why she did what she did. Her name will be cursed for generations. And in Martira, the townspeople mourn their sons and daughters. Let's talk about themes. Traditionally in the Persona games, there's one main overarching theme per game. In Persona 3, that theme is coming to grips with death, in 4, it's Yosuke being homophobic, and in Persona 5, it's youthful rebellion against the corrupt world created by the generations before them. In fact, all three of the modern Personas use 5's main theme as a sub-theme, but 5 was the most focused on it. Metaphor also has a central theme, but it's woven in with a bunch of other themes to create a rich tapestry of meaning. Let's go through a few of them. There's a large undercurrent of anti-conservatism throughout many of the game's storylines. Now, by conservatism, I don't mean the Republican Party in the USA. The game doesn't call out MAGA or anything specific like that. No, I mean the classical idea of conservatism, defined by the Encyclopedia Britannica as a political doctrine that emphasizes the value of traditional institutions and practices. In many parts of the story, the traditional ideas and institutions of Uchronia are challenged. From the very start of the game proper, the idea of a king who is selected merely through bloodline is discarded by the last king himself. The state religion is found to be corrupt, its head committing horrible acts in the name of cementing his own power. In the home of the pagan Mustari tribe, it is found that their tradition of sacrificing their priestesses to their god in times of strife is not only actively harming said god, but also a fundamental misinterpretation of their history that they simply did not choose to question out of complacency. Every single candidate for the throne runs on how they would fundamentally bring change to the country. Luis, the main villain of the game, plans to tear down the entirety of society as we know it because it's the only way he can think of to eliminate the injustices that have taken root in the kingdom. In fact, these promises of change from the candidates are, I think, very relevant to what happened in the recent US election. Donald Trump ran on a platform that promised fundamental changes to the country. Harris basically ran on the status quo. As it turns out, when the country is in a bad place, the candidate promising to actually change things typically gets more support. This is, of course, a lesson the Democratic Party will continue to not learn. Anyway, back to Fantasyland. What's next to talk about? Oh, it's racism. Yay. So in the world of Metaphor, there are 9 tribes. Not only are some tribes seen as lesser than others, but those same lesser tribes are also forced into the lower social and economic classes. For example, the Parapus, a tribe of people with animal features, are near universally treated like mongrels and forced to take on more dangerous work that no one else will touch, purely because no one will hire them at an honest wage. These dangerous jobs include being used as test subjects for the Sanctus Church's igniters, tools which allow anyone to use magic. Basilio, the final party member of the game, and my favorite, is a victim of these experiments. Contrast this to the Clamar, a tribe distinguished by the horns growing out of their heads, who are the most well-off tribe simply due to the fact that the royal family are also Clamar. Clamar face fewer hurdles in their economic and social mobility, and many of the upper-class people the party meets on their journey belong to this tribe, including the aforementioned party member Stroll, who is himself a noble. It's easy to see the parallels to our world's racial disparities, but I just want to take a moment to appreciate that Metaphor makes a big deal out of the economic impacts of racial prejudice instead of focusing solely on the social ones. I feel like you don't see that as much in media. Specifically, there's an idea that comes up a few times of characters of the lesser tribes attempting to overcome their lot in life through effort and personal merit. Both Heisme and one of Luis's men, Zorba, talk about how they sought to make those around them treat them as equals by demonstrating their competency and skill. In both cases, it did not work. Heisme was relegated to a less honorable part of the Royal Knights where he did not have to be seen, and as for Zorba, Luis was the only one who was ever willing to see his potential past his mixed tribe status. But there's something else here too, because the game isn't just talking about how racism is bad, it's also demonstrating the benefits of collective strength. Your team is made up of 8 of the 9 tribes, and this fact is hammered home time and time again. You are living proof that when the tribes come together they can become more than the sum of their parts. Diversity is your strength. Your party members' unique perspectives come together to form a team that can overcome the strongest of obstacles, and this is something that your archenemy, Luis, cannot comprehend because while he doesn't care about tribes, he believes only in the strength of the individual. See, Luis preaches the meritocracy. He wants to create a world where one's standing in life is not measured by the circumstances of their birth but by their ability, their power, and this attracts him many supporters. He preaches that this is equality. Your party, however, is founded on the ideal that the strong should support the weak, that anyone in need of help is worth helping, that together we can carry each other into a better future, and you demonstrate this ideal time and time again. Luis offers only a new kind of division, where the weak are left behind. You offer a slow path to true equality, and so you clash, the strength of the individual versus the strength of the collective, and ultimately, you win. Your ideals win, proven on the final battlefield. And those ideals are another thing the game touches on a lot. See, there's this running motif of fantasy and how it can influence reality. Fantasy takes on a bit of a double meaning in Metaphor. It can mean either fiction or ideals, or sometimes both at the same time. From the beginning of the game, the protagonist is carrying a book. This is the fantasy novel, a banned work of fiction penned by a character named Morn. It tells of a utopian world which, the player comes to realize, is an idealized version of our world. Throughout the game, each of your party members will come to read a few pages from the book, describing something familiar from real life that appears utopian to them, and they'll say something to the effect of, well, this seems unlikely to ever happen. But then they'll wonder, but what if it did? By the end of the game, it is revealed that Metaphor actually takes place in the future of our world. Modern civilization ended by a great war after the discovery of true magic. This book is comprised of Moore's understanding of life as we knew it, but it's also drenched in his own ideals, which is why it's a fantasy. It's an idealized world, half-born from a past civilization that killed itself off long ago. But this fantasy novel serves to inspire several characters from the game, inform their ideals. The protagonist receives his ideals both from this book and from the prince, whom he got the book from in the first place. Luis too has a copy. The fantasy novel is the foundation of everything these characters strive or once strived for. At the beginning of the game, Moore asks you, the player, a question. Is fantasy limited to the confines of the imagination? Would you call it a powerless creation? I like to believe the answer is no. As an author, I like to believe that fiction can touch someone's heart, make them consider things they'd never thought of before, see things from new angles. It's impossible for me to ever know if anything I'll write will ever truly connect with someone, but one can hope. At least in the confines of metaphor, fantasy creates ideals, ideals create fantasy, and together they can change the world. None of this is the central theme though, believe it or not, because the central theme of metaphor is anxiety. Anxiety comes up a lot in metaphor. It is the source of the magic in this world. Embracing one's anxieties and moving forward with them is what grants you an archetype. Doing the opposite, not being able to face overwhelming anxieties, may result in you turning into a human. There's even a status effect called anxiety. The game loves this word. As with pretty much every other keyword in metaphor, it's used a little broadly. My understanding is that it encompasses not just what we think of as anxiety, but also a whole range of similar emotions, including things like fear, cognitive dissonance, etc. Negative emotions stemming both from inside us and from the state of the world around us. To quote Katsura Hashino himself in an interview for the Atlas Brand 35th anniversary book, "Well, everyone grapples with anxiety to some extent, right? There are books that discuss how anxiety comes from having to face unknowns, from a lack of experience. Facing that anxiety allows you to learn and move forward, but if you only ever hesitate and avoid it, nothing will change. Thinking deeper about it, this idea hit me that feeling anxious over something is an opportunity to move forward. But there's an interesting wrinkle in this. See, a recurring idea in the story of metaphor is a group of people foisting their anxieties onto the shoulders of someone else, instead of taking action themselves. For example, this can be seen in the storyline of one of your party members, Yufa, who is to be sacrificed by her people for the sake of calming their god's anger. It is specifically stated that Yufa has been shouldering her people's anxieties all her life. Take also the social link of Barden, who was appointed leader of Martira and then later ousted by a rival. After he nearly dies protecting the town from a human, the people realize they had been forcing their anxieties onto him, expecting him to take care of everything for them, and then getting upset with him when he didn't do it in exactly the way they wanted. This can even be applied to the Sanctist's god. A Mustari woman states that the Sanctists entrust all their worries to God and ask for his forgiveness. This comes to a head, though, with the Royal Scepter. The Scepter is introduced very early into the game. Zorba, who I mentioned earlier, is sent to retrieve it by Luis, but he fails and it is taken out of the picture by the king. When Luis later manages to get his hands on it, it is revealed that it is an ancient artifact that absorbs the anxieties of all the citizens of Uchronia, pacifying them, but also leaving them unable to face what causes those anxieties. In this way, the people of Uchronia are robbed of their ability to enact real change, and this is why the kingdom has stagnated so. And the royal scepter is, of course, wielded by the royal family, by the king. So it seems that metaphor is trying to draw a contrast between being able to face one's anxieties oneself, to fight for change, and instead offloading those anxieties onto an authority of some kind and becoming complacent. You need to be able to face your anxieties yourself to be able to move forward, but you can't do that if you leave all that to someone or something else. No one person can fix everything. We all need to work together. And I think the game is saying too that it's okay to be anxious. We treat anxiety as a scary thing, and let's be real, it is, but it's also what tells us that something is wrong. Maybe if something is making you anxious, it's more important to address the thing making you anxious than it is the anxiety itself. So with all of that said, what is metaphor a metaphor for? Well, I think, like most stories, it's a metaphor for us. What's going on in our world right now? The struggle between the new and the old, the struggle between the strong and the weak, the struggle between those who fight for progress and those who would see us all give up and dance to the beat of their drum. All of it is contained within this game. If games are art, this is surely art. All of this is not to say that Metaphor is a perfect game. It's not. For example, the second half of the fourth major dungeon, the Dragon Temple, is just terrible. I get that it's supposed to be a reference to Etrian Odyssey, complete with FOEs, but it ends up just being a poorly paced maze that's boring and frustrating to navigate and filled with way too many enemies. And Gallica, the protagonist's fairy companion and the game's equivalent to Teddy or Morgana, is not as interesting as either of those characters and doesn't really have a ton going for her. This is especially evident in her social link, which doesn't really seem to know what it wants to be. But these are small things. They bring a 10 out of 10 down to like a 9.8. The overall package is only marginally besmirched. And of course there's always the possibility they'll fix them in the inevitable re-release of this game that we all know is coming. Atlas, you can't surprise us anymore! So, let's return to that discarded title from earlier. Is Metaphor ReFantazio the best Persona game? I can't answer that objectively, but I can tell you why Metaphor is the best Persona game for me. Sure, it's easy to point out mechanical improvements or convenience features and say something is objectively better, but that's not going to be universally true for everyone. And I'm just one person, I can't speak for everyone. This whole video is just my thoughts, my perspective. So why is it the best Persona game for me? To tell you that, I need to tell you why I like Persona, and to tell you that, I need to tell you why I've always struggled to get into SMT. Shin Megami Tensei stories are complex, sweeping. They have grand scopes, reality-shifting implications. SMT 3 starts with a brief prologue before the gosh darn capital A apocalypse happens. And I have trouble appreciating the grandness of these stories because they feel very impersonal. A story so grand doesn't have time to focus on the little things. The small moments of characters interacting, growing closer or farther, intimacy. These aren't personal stories, they're so big they almost can't be. And Persona's stories are kind of the opposite of that. They're almost entirely about the small things, the characters, how they interact. Sure, the endings usually have the fate of everything the characters know at stake, but most of the story leading up to that is just them getting to know each other, becoming friends. This is why I love Persona's writing. It's intimate. It's personal. I did not think I would be into Metaphor ReFantazio. I've never been a big high fantasy kind of person. On paper, I prefer stories with settings like the Persona games in a contemporary version of our world where strange events begin occurring. Supernatural, modern fantasy, horror, that sort of thing. But what I got out of Metaphor is the same kind of personal, intimate storytelling I love about Persona, and I think it's some of the best writing Atlus has ever produced. The greater scope of the story and the freedom of the new IP allowed the writers to pull off things a Persona game never could, and that's why I think Metaphor ReFantazio is the best Persona game for me. It delivers what I love about the Persona franchise, and it does so in spectacular fashion. And that's where the video was going to end. This is where what I thought would be the final draft of my script ended anyway. But as I was reading it for voiceover, I started to feel like there was something missing, some final piece to tie the whole thing together. Well, I just ran half naked out of the shower to write this down because I think I might have finally figured out what that something is. See, as I've alluded to throughout this video, I experienced Metaphor for the first time during a very pressure-on period of American politics. The run-up to the election was in full swing, polls were showing hair-thin margins, and it was a complete toss-up who was going to win. Steam says that I first started the game on October 20th. You know what else happened on October 20th? Trump's McDonald's stunt. Everything was going bad, and I needed a breather. What perfect timing for a 100-hour fantasy RPG to fall into my lap. And I'll admit to this, I'm kind of a passive consumer of media most of the time. It's a weakness of mine. I like immersing myself in something for a while, and that unfortunately for me means that I just kind of sink into it. I have to actively choose to think critically about things I consume, and it can be very tiring for me to do so. All of this is to say, in my first playthrough of Metaphor, I got out of it what I wanted at the time, which was escapism. It was a way to tune out the horrors of the real world and just enjoy myself. And when I got to those ending credits, I felt a little dissatisfied. Not because I hadn't gotten what I'd wanted, but because I had a nagging feeling I'd missed something. I could tell the game was trying to say things beyond the overt anti-racism stuff, but I couldn't really put my finger on what. The pieces weren't connecting. But I knew I wanted to make a video about it, and to do that I'd need to play through it again anyway to collect footage, so might as well be more active in my consumption this time. I cataloged everything. I downloaded Obsidian and I wrote up my own little wiki on this game. Every major character, every major location, all the themes I could identify. The files for my notes are 214 kilobytes, which some online calculators put it between 33,000 and 43,000 words. I was thorough. And at the end, I came away from it with all this meaning that I had just missed the first time through. I can appreciate this game as art now. I couldn't do that before. And this brings me to the note that I want to end on, because having experienced both, I don't want to condemn either way of consuming this game. Enjoying things as escapism is a coping method. It's a way we can manage our stress when times are tough. Consuming things from a critical perspective can get us more meaning out of an experience, it can leave us with thoughts we'll have for the rest of our lives, but sometimes that's just not something we're prepared for, and that's okay too. But I do think escapism should be done in moderation. Too much escapism is similar to the abdication of personal responsibility we see time and time again in metaphor. If you're constantly running away from your anxieties through the medium of fiction, then you aren't facing them, and they will only grow stronger. I think this is just yet another way that metaphor explores the intersection between its themes, and that, to me, is special. So, as we move forwards towards an uncertain next 4 years in America, know that it's okay sometimes to look away, but it's never okay to turn away. Societal progress is possible despite the opposition, but it's something we have to fight for, and we can't do that if we can't overcome our own anxieties to do so. We'll make it through this together, no matter what they throw at us. I know we will. But hey, speaking of escapism, did I mention the game lets you beat up a libertarian? If that doesn't get people to play it, I don't know what will.